Hello everybody, glad to be back with you again today, bringing you another message. This one is titled Majority. Young Defensio Bonaiuti was a young man who could do many things, but maybe not as well as others around him. For example, he could play the lute, but his brother played it better. He thought as he was growing up maybe he'd like to be a priest, but in the end he changed his mind about that too and decided that calling wasn't really for him. His father encouraged him to study to be a doctor, and in the end he went along with his father's plans, thinking, well, that was as good a thing to do as anything. But one day when he was at the university, he accidentally stumbled into a geometry class. And unlike most of us who might have been horrified at that, he actually was delighted. And as he sat and listened, he thought, I think actually this kind of thing would be more my calling than medicine. Took a long conversation and lots of pleading with his father before he agreed, but eventually he did enter that field of study, and in fact became respected and successful in his field. That wasn't until he had the audacity to do a very foolish thing. You see, he disagreed with the majority, and that was a fatal flaw. From this point on, Defensio Bonaiuti had a difficult life. In fact, as they looked at his conclusions, they described them as foolish and absurd in philosophy, and in fact formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Well, perhaps you've heard of this young man. Well, maybe I should give you his full name. His full name was Galileo Defensio Bonaiuti de Galilei, or of course Galileo Galilei. And famously, he disagreed with the majority. How did that go for him? Well, the view that he had at that time was very much against what people believed to be the foundation of the universe and the world that we knew. They believed that we were at the very center of all things. As they looked to the sky, they saw the sun moving and the planets and the stars moving, and believed that they, in fact, were circling about us. And this very much seemed to fit in with the spiritual aspect of us being God's special creation. This point of view was called the geocentric or Aristotelian point of view. And it was believed that, in fact, we were at the very center. Now, Galileo, of course, took a different point of view. He took the Copernican or the heliocentric view, that in fact we were not the center of the universe. We weren't even the center of our own solar system. We revolved around the sun. Well, many people disagreed with that, and it caused him a lot of trouble. In fact, the result was that the Roman Inquisition was called, and from 1615 to 1616 they investigated to see if he had in fact performed a crime in coming up with this particular conclusion. You didn't really like having the Roman Inquisition called on you. Any inquisition always meant bad news for the person being inquired of, because the Inquisition was basically there to see one thing: were you guilty or were you innocent? And if you were guilty, the consequences could be quite catastrophic. In the end, the Roman Inquisition concluded this: that indeed he was incorrect in his view that the world was not the center of the universe, that the sun was the center and we revolved around it. They instructed him to abandon this idea completely. In fact, they said the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and the earth moves, and henceforth not to hold, teach, or defend in any way whatever, either orally or in writing, this particular conclusion. Well, Galileo valued his life, and so he agreed. And for many years it continued in this way. He said nothing publicly that would cause any difficulty for himself. A few years later this did change, though, when a supporter of his ascended to the papal throne. This supporter in 1632 became Pope Urban VIII. And Pope Urban VIII wanted to be a more enlightened pope, and someone who would look perhaps to both sides of the argument. And so he asked Galileo, he said, I would like you to write some sort of lessons and a conclusion on this which would actually represent both sides fairly. I'd like you to examine and consider both aspects, but fairly, and not draw any conclusion, just simply say, yes, here are the 2 points of view. And so Galileo did what he was asked. He wrote an article describing this very division within human knowledge. It was called The Dialogue Concerning Two Chief World Systems. And in this, the two sides were discussing which was superior. Well, poor old Galileo just really couldn't help himself, because he really believed that his point of view was the superior one. And so, in this particular work, the one who was set aside to defend the point of view of the geocentric, that the world was at the center of the universe, was given the name Simplicio, which didn't really seem too complimentary. Simplicio meaning as in simpleton or Mr. Stupid. Yes, the Pope's point of view of the geocentric view of the universe was defended in Galileo's work by Mr. Stupid. The Pope didn't see the funny side of that. In fact, he was very angry that this man he had supported seemed to suggest that his point of view was the one held by simpletons. Well, the Roman Inquisition was called in again, and this time they concluded that he was vehemently suspect of heresy. Perhaps it was because it was only suspect of heresy that he was not burned, but the punishment was severe. From 1633 until 1642, he was placed under house arrest, never to leave his home again until the day he died. And he was not to present to anyone his view of the heliocentric idea of the world revolving around the sun. Of course, sneakily, Galileo was writing a book that would posthumously be published, but he could publicly say nothing to anyone during the rest of his life. And yet the words often ascribed as his dying words show that he still understood the truth. And yet it moves, he said. He knew that the world moved and was not still at the center of the universe. Well, of course, we understand in Galileo's time, Galileo was in the minority. Did that make Galileo wrong? In fact, not. The majority were wrong, and Galileo was right. You know, in that sense, I think often we would be wise to question the majority. There have been many in our society over the years who have questioned whether the majority is always the right side to be on. The great author Mark Twain once wrote, "Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect." Yes, if you find yourself agreeing with everyone else, then maybe you should actually take a moment or two to consider whether you might be right, because the majority often is not. Claude MacDonald isn't necessarily a famous man to many. He was a diplomat of the British Empire. He was ambassador to Japan. He was also responsible for Britain acquiring a 99-year lease on Hong Kong. At one point he came to this conclusion. He says, sometimes a majority simply means that all of the fools are on the same side. Which is a good point. Often that can be the case. Just because everyone is on the same side doesn't mean the wisdom rests on that side also. One of my favorite British authors said this: "The third-rate mind is only happy when it is thinking with the majority." So yes, as a third-rate mind, we'll be happy when we think the same as everyone else, because we must be right. After all, everyone else thinks the same. The second-rate mind, however, is only happy when it is thinking with the minority. In this instance, we might think, well, the majority quite often is wrong. I'm going the other way. I'll think with the minority, then I'm going to be right. However, the first-rate mind is only happy when it is thinking. And that's very wise advice, because actually, sometimes the majority is right. Sometimes the minority is right. But to have a first-rate mind, we must be thinking in order to discern the difference between those different events. That author, by the way, was A.A. Milne, which I don't know if you recognize that name, but it's the Winnie the Pooh guy. For a bear of little brain, I think A.A. Milne was a pretty smart guy. You know, when you think about it, God probably has a pretty troubled relationship when it comes to the majority. The majority and God don't often seem to be on the same side. We're told this: the Lord did not set his affection on you, the Israelites in other words, and choose you because you were more numerous than the other peoples. For you were the fewest of all peoples. Deuteronomy 7:7. And you know, when you look at Paul, he actually describes it that within that minority of the Israelites, there is even a smaller minority who would follow God. Romans 9:27. Though the number of the Israelites could be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved. So there's only a remnant of the remnant, a small section of a small section that might indeed follow God's way and be saved. Now we might look at that and think, well, that's very unfair. God's very unfair. Why is he only allowing the minority? It's not God's choice. In fact, John 3:16 famously tells us, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes on him might not perish, but have everlasting life. God loves the world. I guess the question in return is, does the world love him? And sadly, that often isn't the case. God would save all in this world if the choice was his. But the choice is theirs. As Jesus famously said, many are called, but few are chosen. Jesus does the calling. We do the choosing. Jesus once famously said this of Jerusalem in Matthew 23:37. He said, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. And that is the position that God is in. He would save the majority, but would the majority want to be saved? Perhaps a question we might ask is the majority usually right? Well, there are certainly instances where the majority indeed is right. We all pretty much agree that the sky is blue and the grass is green. But there are many other instances where, in fact, the majority may be wrong, such as in Galileo's time. In fact, there may be even things in our society today which are generally accepted and generally believed to be wise and correct, that in 100 years' time, people may look back, scratch their heads, and say, how in the world did they believe that? I think it's often the case that it's very difficult for us to see the flaws in our own society and our own logic. And so often we have to be aware that the majority can very often, in fact, be wrong. And the question I guess we might have is, why do we go wrong? Why do we draw these incorrect conclusions? Well, I think there's a number of possible reasons. One example is that we have a false sense of superiority. We feel that our intellect is just so much above everyone else's that we couldn't possibly be incorrect or fooled about anything. And perhaps if the majority feel that way, we all go along with the same wrong conclusions. Let me give you an example. There was a study done a few years ago which tested what was said about intelligence in the United States. Not the level of intelligence, but the level of perceived intelligence. They asked people if they believed that they were above average intellectually. Well, what percentage would you suggest that might be? Probably somewhere around 50% might be above average. That would seem pretty fair, but actually 65% of Americans believed that they were above average, which is a little mathematically challenged. This particular survey didn't ask this question, but another survey I found asked Americans if they believed that they were below average intelligence. You have to be pretty careful about asking a question like that. You might get a punch in the nose if you go up to someone and say, are you below average intelligence? But apparently they managed to ask these questions without too much bodily harm. What percentage of Americans believed that they were below average intelligence? Well, in fact, that was 4%, which is very mathematically challenged. 4% of people believed that they were below average intelligence. Everyone else believed they were either average or above. Sounds kind of unlikely. But then I found that there was actually some newspaper articles where people were trying to suggest the same thing. Bloomberg had an opinion article which said, what if most people are actually above average? Well, as someone who teaches math, I kind of scratched my head at this idea. Most people above average? That's not how math works. Average is pretty much in the middle, the 50% range. If you're below that, you're below average. Above that, above average. How can most people be above average? You know, this is something I try not to tell my kids at school because, well, they've probably come to the conclusion already anyway, but math is not your friend. You may be highly offended about the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but I have to tell you, math doesn't care. It's not going to succumb to your arguments or to your whining or your pouting. If you don't like how math works, that's just kind of too bad. It's not going to change. Maybe for that reason, some of the kids I've taught math to have often concluded that math is so mean. And my conclusion to that is, well, that's just average. There's a math joke there, by the way, if you missed it, but that's the way I always get them to remember that mean is the average. But how could it possibly be true that the majority of people could be above average? Well, I guess the only way you can really have it is if maybe you had a huge section of the population that was very, very, very low in intelligence, and then a fairly sizable population, more than 50%, that was kind of in the middle and not too far off of that. Then maybe you might work with that. But I have to say, do we really have enough politicians to make up those low IQ numbers? Ooh, that was mean. Okay, maybe I should edit that out. Nah, I'll keep it in. But don't tell anyone. But you know, this idea of limited awareness of our own intelligence and limitations is really significant. You know, the Bible says this in Isaiah 5:21, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. That can really be a problem. If you are wise in your own eyes, it really can be a problem. Psalmist says this, or in fact that was Solomon who said this, do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than him. Proverbs 26:12. And indeed, when we feel that we are wise in our own eyes, that is when we are in the most danger. Because when we feel that we are wise, we don't have anything left to learn. And so we stop taking in new information. And all of us have to understand that we still have something to learn. And so that is why it is very important that we don't have an inflated view of our own intelligence and wisdom. You know, the people that Jesus tried to speak to when he was on earth, the Pharisees and the learned and the scribes, these people were very hard for Jesus to reach. In fact, he had the people who were considered pretty scummy people, like fishermen and tax collectors and harlots. These were the people who Jesus could reach. But the wise people, they weren't listening. Jesus said this to them. He said, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied, but you remain guilty because you claim that you can see. John 9:41. In other words, this wisdom of theirs, this knowledge, this book learning that they'd had, actually kind of got in the way of them really being able to see. They claimed to be able to see. They claimed to be so wise, but that actually held them back. And that can often be the way with us. You know, even Solomon had problems with that. Ecclesiastes is a very bitter book written at the end of Solomon's life, and maybe finally he's getting to be as wise as God promised him he would be, but it didn't all come the easy way. When he was truly wise at the end of his life, Solomon said this, I am determined to be wise is what I had said, but that was beyond me. So it's only actually as you understand that wisdom is beyond you that maybe you become truly wise, because then you can learn much more. I've seen some interesting thoughts of the intellectualizing of things and how we really shouldn't take our Christianity quite as seriously as we have done in the past. I saw this quote from John Shelby Spong recently. He said this: "Unless biblical literalism is challenged overtly in the Christian church itself, it will, in my opinion, kill the Christian faith." In other words, his conclusion is that we shouldn't take the Bible so literally. We shouldn't understand things just on its face value in the Bible. Continuing, this bishop says, "It is not just a benign nuisance that afflicts Christianity at its edges. It is a mentality that renders the Christian faith unbelievable to an increasing number of citizens of our world." So the conclusion is that people aren't going to believe Christianity because it believes the Bible. By the way, I have read that book. It's called Why Christianity Must Change or Die. And really, the conclusion of that book, I don't know. In the end, it seems to be that the only way Christianity can survive is if it actually stops being Christianity. It's a little bit as if, I don't know, somebody sold the Ford Motor Company to a Korean company. They started making cars and slapping a Ford sticker on it. Would it still be a Ford car? Would Christianity still be Christianity if we totally gutted everything it meant to be Christian, but then stuck a little cross symbol on it? Would it really continue to exist as anything at all? I understand where Bishop Spong is going with his thinking, but it's not something that actually is Christian at all. In fact, when you look at the history of Christianity, and you have to say that, in fact, the whole history of Christianity, it has been the case that Christianity is not considered that area for those who are wise. In fact, since when has Christianity based itself on public opinion? Even in its earliest stages, Christianity was not seen that way. Paul said this: "Jews demand signs and Greeks search for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." And that's from 1 Corinthians 1:22-23. And that's really worth considering. In other words, it wasn't accepted by the Jews. It wasn't accepted by the Gentiles. They thought it was dumb. They thought it was stupid. It didn't fit in with anything in their society at the time. Because if you rule out Jews and you rule out Gentiles, there's nothing left in this world. So even in its earliest days, Christianity was considered foolishness. So Bishop Spong clearly isn't understanding the history of Christianity. Just because the world doesn't accept it doesn't mean it's something unusual. Paul spoke quite a lot of this. In fact, if you look in the book of 1 Corinthians, a lot of the first section of this letter to the church in Corinth, he is speaking to this very issue. He says, "But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, for the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." Kind of a hyperbolic way to put it, but Paul's basically saying, yeah, you got you on your best day, and you got God on his worst day. He's still smarter than you. And you got you on your strongest day, and God on his weakest day. He's still stronger than you. And of course, God doesn't have a day when he is less wise than any other. But if that were even to be the case, we couldn't measure up. And yet often we trust our own intellect and our own wisdom far more than the wisdom of God. Paul continues, says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to the worldly standards. Not many of you were powerful. Not many of you were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong." That's from 1 Corinthians 1:24-27. And there's a lot of wisdom there. And it's not that the people who are intellectual and educated are any less approachable to God in his desire to teach them. It's that they are closed in their own mind. They feel so wise that they can't accept any new information. That's kind of an interesting thing when you think about many Christian churches still go for the idea that you should have a master's degree or a doctorate in order to be a preacher. But in Jesus' time, people that were chosen were fishermen and tax collectors. That certainly doesn't mean that a higher education isn't of value. But what must not be lost in that higher education is the ability to still be taught, and the ability to understand that even in all of our worldly wisdom, we have a lot to learn, because God has a lot to teach us. And so this idea that we are so wise really does often get in the way. Paul says this, we declare God's wisdom. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. That's from 1 Corinthians 2, 7 and 14. You know, when you think about going against the wisdom of this world and going against incredible odds, I think of someone like Elijah. You know, Elijah was one of the few prophets of God left. And he went for this showdown on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. The odds were terrible. 450 prophets of Baal to one prophet of God. And there was Elijah, standing alone. Now the people of Israel, a number of them came to watch the showdown as well. Maybe they would be on Elijah and God's side. Elijah made a call for that at the beginning. He told the people of Israel, he said, how long will you not decide between your two choices? If the Lord is the true God, follow him. But if Baal is the true God, follow him. You know, often we think that the ancient Israelites abandoned God totally, but they really were trying to keep a foot in both camps, you know, keep it covered both ways. And a lot of times in Christianity, we can do the same. We try and keep our foot in both camps, a bit in the world and a bit in the church, and hopefully it'll kind of all work out in the end. Well, Elijah made this very determined and clear, stark call for the people to choose a side. And the people's response? The people said nothing. That's from 1 Kings 18:21. And I think that silence was probably pretty deafening because Elijah knew they were just waiting to see who was going to win. That's probably the side they were going to choose. So I imagine as Elijah was standing there on top of Mount Carmel, he was aware that he was surrounded by no friends at all and an awful lot of enemies. He was not in the majority. I'm sure he would have felt as the psalmist did in Psalm 69:4, for those who hate me without reason outnumber the very hairs of my head. I guess there's a reason why I'm more popular than you, maybe. I've got less enemies, clearly. But even in those circumstances, he did know that he had God with him. Now Elijah, what he was doing on Mount Carmel, really, to the worldly eyes at the time, was very, very foolish. Another name for Baal is Hadad, by the way. And he was an ancient god. I decided to look him up on Wikipedia. Don't recommend you do that with most things. Wikipedia can be as wrong as anything. But on this instance, they had a good quote about Hadad. Hadad was the storm and rain god in the Canaanite and Mesopotamian religions. Storm and rain god. Well, if you remember the beginning of the story of Elijah, the one very thing that he challenged King Ahab, and by connection, the god he worshipped, Baal, on, was that there was going to be a drought, that there was going to be no rain in the land at all. And so people looking at Elijah and the challenge he set up would have thought he was very dumb. For his period of time, he took on the rain god with rain. And everybody knew, you don't take on Baal when rain is on the line. You try something else. You'd say, I'll send frogs. You're not worshiping the frog god, right? I'll send frogs. I'll outsmart him that way. I'll do something else. But Elijah took on the world's wisdom, took it on head on and said, I'm taking the rain god on and I'm going to stop it raining. Sometimes the wisdom of this world is not correct. People at the time thought Elijah was foolish, but he wasn't. You know, Peter talks about what it will be like in the last days, and he says, above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. Scoffing, mocking, belittling. Sounds like your average comedy show these days, doesn't it? You know, a lot of comedy these days. I remember back in the days when Laurel and Hardy would take a pie to the face, and that would be pretty funny. These days, it seems we're not really happy unless we're making somebody else look small. You know, maybe someone of a different political opinion or someone of a different view on one issue or another, and we'll belittle them and we'll mock them and we'll scoff. Peter was very right. Our age is definitely one of scoffers and mockers. And one of the things that the wisdom of this age will not accept is that Jesus is coming again. They will scoff and mock at that. As Peter says, they will say, where is this coming? He has promised. Ever since our ancestors died, everything has just gone on the same since the beginning of creation. And that's from 2 Peter 3, 3-4. And we can definitely see that. You know, the reason we scoff, the reason we mock others is because we are so secure in our own intelligence that we belittle others with a different point of view. But you know, that's the very time when we are at our least intelligent because maybe we're not able to receive any more information. Another possible reason, I think, why people miss out on the truth and maybe follow a majority that might be wrong is because maybe they don't have enough information. A lot of times we form opinions about things that we just really don't have enough information that we should be forming an opinion. Here's a question that was asked in a questionnaire in 2012. Cloud computing. Now, maybe you know what cloud computing is and maybe you don't. Basically, it's kind of a data storage network that allows you to store things not just on your computer, but in other more central data storage networks. The question was asked, is the cloud affected by stormy weather? Well, of course, the cloud really has nothing to do with any meteorological happening at all. So that really shouldn't be the case. But in this survey in 2012, 51% of Americans asked believed that the cloud would be affected by stormy weather. Maybe it would be fair to ask this question, which they did. Do you actually know what the cloud really is? So they asked them before their opinion on whether it was affected by stormy weather. Then they asked them, do you actually know what the cloud is? And sadly, the number who were able to answer yes was 16%. Which goes to show there was a huge percentage of people that had an opinion about the cloud that didn't even know what the cloud was. And maybe that's often a problem we have. We have an opinion about things that we don't even know enough about. This survey was quite interesting. They actually suggested that on first dates, 1/3 of people lied about knowing what the cloud was. Dating must have changed since my day. I don't think I ever talked about the cloud or any techno gizmos on my first dates, but these modern kids, eh? Well, before we start feeling too secure on everything, that we have all the knowledge, maybe I should ask you a few questions and see exactly where you are on things. Here's a question for you. What is coffee made from? Well, if you said coffee beans, sorry, it's not actually a bean. They are seeds. So coffee is made from coffee seeds. That's a little mind-altering there, but how about this one? What is the dark side of the moon like? Well, the answer actually is it's light, because the simple fact that we don't see the other side of the moon doesn't mean that it's dark. The sun also strikes on that side of the moon. So that's a misnomer. It is, in fact, not the dark side of the moon. It is more accurately the far side of the moon. But the side we see doesn't get any more sunlight than the side we don't see. That's kind of surprising. Okay, how about this one? What is the tallest mountain in the world? Now, maybe like me, you might guess probably Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. You would be wrong. In fact, the tallest mountain in the world is Mauna Kea. Now, I'm going to have to explain this one to you. Mauna Kea is, in fact, the tallest mountain. It is not the highest mountain. Mauna Kea begins much closer to sea level than Mount Everest. So while Mount Everest is, in fact, higher, it is not taller because it begins at a higher elevation and doesn't go as much distance as Mauna Kea. That's kind of mind-blowing, really, but there you go. Okay, here's the last one. And maybe it'll depend on your age as to whether this one makes any sense to you, but is VeggieTales an honest show? For those of you that know VeggieTales, no doubt have seen it, might think there's lots of good things in there, but is it an honest show? Well, I'm going to say nope. And here's the reason why. It's called VeggieTales. Well, thinking of the characters, let's see. Madame Blueberry is a blueberry. That's a fruit. Jim and Jerry Gourd are gourds, which is a fruit. The French peas, well, the pod is actually the fruit. They're the seed, which still isn't a veggie. Mr. Nezer is a zucchini. That's a fruit. Paw Grape is, well, you know what a grape is. That's a fruit. Bob the Tomato, that's a fruit. And Larry the Cucumber, another fruit. I'm sorry, it is not VeggieTales. It is Fruity Tales. And you have been lied to your whole youth and childhood. Sorry to disappoint you and disillusion you. It should actually be called Fruity Tales. Doesn't sound quite right, but there you go. You know, there's a lot of times when we just don't have the knowledge or the wisdom that we think we do. God warns his people. He says, "My people are destroyed from a lack of knowledge." But then he says something very important. He says, "Because you have rejected knowledge, I also have rejected you." Hosea 4:6. So it's not even the fact that they didn't have the knowledge. They just actually rejected it. You know, people might look at something like the destruction of Sodom and say, how unkind God was. You know, the city of Sodom was destroyed suddenly. And God didn't go on, knock on every single door, just saying, you know, hey, come on, come out. There's going to be a fire here. Everybody out. Rouse, rouse, schnell, schnell, out, out. Didn't do any of that. Does that mean God is unkind? Well, we do know that only a few escaped. But God gave them opportunities. You know, as Abraham was speaking with God, there was an opportunity there. It says, finally Abraham said, "Please don't get angry, Lord, if I speak just once more. Suppose you should only find 10 good people there." Hopefully at least 10 people will watch this video. Hey, we've saved the world. 10 good people. 10 people in a whole city, and God would save that city. If only there were 10. Because the Lord said, for the sake of 10 good people, I still won't destroy that city. Genesis 18:32. Well, we know sadly there weren't 10 good people in the city of Sodom. But you know, that even wasn't their first chance to be saved. They had had many opportunities. Abraham and Lot had interacted with them often and tried to spread God's word to them. Abraham had rescued the people of Sodom when their city had been sacked by a foreign king and all of their people and their plunder was stolen. And when Abraham came back, they said, well, please free the people, but you can keep all our treasure. You know, that can be your reward for saving us. But Abraham said, no, I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread. And that's from Genesis 14:22 to 23. You know, Abraham had given them ample witness to the fact that God loved them and that he was there to help them. But they had rejected that knowledge. And so when the end came, maybe it seemed like a surprise, but the warning had been given many, many times. And you know, the same example is given with how Jesus returns. It is described as being like a thief in the night, an unexpected, surprising, and maybe potentially unpleasant for some experience. But the warning has already been given many times. The question is, has the knowledge been rejected? There is much in this world that actually demonstrates that God is alive and working in our lives. The psalmist says this, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, Psalm 19:1. You can just look at the skies and the heavens and you can see God's work. And on the earth, Paul describes it this way in Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without an excuse. So people have every ability to see and understand what is truly there. I think that's maybe part of the reason why we have evolution in this world, because people don't believe. And when you don't believe that God created this world, you don't question where you were created, you came from slime, and you don't question where you're going. Another potential reason why people follow the crowd and just don't think too much about it is a lack of interest in the truth. Probably should never put a picture of someone yawning in a sermon. That's a good opportunity to make you feel like yawning when you see someone else doing that. But you know, maybe it is true that people just aren't that interested in the truth. Here's a question from a survey. It said they asked British teens how many of them believed that Sherlock Holmes was real. Sherlock Holmes, the fictional detective written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Well, that percentage actually was 58% of British teenagers believed that Sherlock Holmes was a real historical figure. I lived in Britain for many years, and they used to tell me how dumb Americans were. Maybe they thought that because they hung out with me. I don't know. But we're not the only ones. They also asked these British teens if they believed that Richard I was a fictional character or not. Well, the number that believed that Richard I, Richard the Lionheart of England, was fictional was, in fact, 47%. Which, when you consider those who didn't know one way or the other, that's still a majority. Thought that he was fake too. So they didn't know that Sherlock Holmes was fake or that Richard I was real. I always kind of think the clue is in the name, Richard I, which means there was a second and a third, but apparently not. How about this? And this might explain why it is that people know so little about history. What percentage of British teens have never read anything about history at all in their life? Or at least willingly. Maybe in school they might have been forced to. And the answer is 77%. Pretty huge. What percentage of teens would change the channel immediately, diving for the remote control, demanding that they watch something else if a single thing of historical importance came on to their TV show? Well, that percentage would be 61%. People just aren't interested in history. And so it's a little surprise to us then that they know so little about it, because they're just not interested. You know, it was the same at the time of Noah. Peter describes it this way. He describes that God brought the flood on the world and its ungodly people, but he protected Noah, who was a preacher of righteousness. And also his 7 family members were also saved. That's from 2 Peter 2:5. You know, Peter was a preacher of righteousness. For 120 years he preached the righteousness and the salvation offered to those people if they would join and go aboard the ark. But, of course, they didn't accept. Jesus describes what happened at that time. He says as well that it will be similar when Jesus comes again into his kingdom. It says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage up to the very day that Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what happened until the flood came and took them all away. That's how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Matthew 24:37-39. Now, some people look at that text and say, well, that must mean that Noah didn't preach. And yet we know that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So it wasn't that Noah wasn't preaching to the people before the flood came. They just weren't that interested. And so it came to them as a surprise. They knew nothing about it because they didn't care to know about it. And you can see that connection with what happens when Jesus returns. Because people, it's not that they haven't had the opportunity to learn from the Bible and from the teachings of the churches that Jesus is coming again. They just weren't that interested. And so it will again come as a complete surprise. And so it's the case that many times people just follow the majority view because they're not really that interested to investigate and to find out anything different. Another reason why people often go along with the majority is simply fear. Now, sometimes that can be a fear of standing out and being a little bit different, which can be awkward. But often the fear can go deeper than that. Did you know, for example, that North Korea has elections? Wonder if they're as exciting as our ones. Well, they had one in March 2014. Care to guess what the turnout was? What percentage of the population decided to come out and vote in the elections? Well, yeah, in fact, it was 100%. Every single person in the country voted. Wow, we should be jealous, right? I mean, we don't get 100% turnout. And of that 100%, what percentage do you suspect might have voted for Kim Jong-un in that election? Well, given that Kim Jong-un isn't somebody you want for an enemy, maybe it would be pretty high. In fact, it was 100%. Now, I agree with you. You're probably thinking, I don't think that that actually is a literal correct number. I'm sure there must have been at least someone who voted against him. Officially, no. Officially, every single ballot cast was for Kim Jong-un. Eat your heart out, any presidential candidate or prime ministerial candidate that might want to achieve that. But I don't think that, that is actually totally false, that figure. Oh, I doubt that every single ballot was for Kim Jong-un. But you don't mess with Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un got angry with his uncle on one occasion, and he instructed some of his men to be sure that they killed his uncle. But not just that they killed him, but that they obliterated him. In fact, he didn't want one atom, one tiny particle of his uncle to be left to commemorate him at all. And so he was mortared to death and completely eradicated from the face of the earth. I don't think anybody wanted to mess with Kim Jong-un. So I'm going to guess that even though 100% is probably an inflated figure, I bet it was pretty close. You don't think there's a way they could find out what your secret ballot was? Yeah, I think a lot of people probably would have voted out of fear. If you think of ancient times and maybe a type of Kim Jong-un character, you couldn't think of a king more like him maybe in some ways than King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And he erected this statue, and everyone was to bow to it. The question was, would anyone stand up to their fears? The command was given, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And just to make sure they understood what was at stake, they were told, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. That's from Daniel 3:5-6. I always kind of like that picture, You can see that guy pulling on, I don't know if it's Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego's arm. He's saying, get down, you idiot. You're going to get burned. But those three young men were brave enough to stand and not go along with the majority. Now, do you suppose the majority of those people bowing there believed that that God could give them great powers and was worthy of worship? I don't think so. They weren't necessarily going along with the majority because they believed it. They were going along with the majority because they didn't want to get burned. And so these three young men had to be different. They had to be the minority. You know, I like what the Bible tells us. It says, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. So don't do what's popular. Don't do what everyone else is doing. And then he says something interesting. He says, and do not show favoritism to the poor person in a lawsuit. That's from Exodus 23:3. Now, I can understand needing to give advice that we don't follow the crowd and that we don't do what the rich people would like, because there's a lot of temptation there to follow the crowd and do what the rich people would like, because maybe they might reward us or we at least might be safe. But God gives the opposite instruction too and says, and by the way, don't favor the poor person either. That's a very important thing. Not that we choose to follow the crowd and the popular, but also that we do not follow the unpopular and the poor and the oppressed. We simply follow what is right. You know, I've noticed a lot of that in America, where we might say, oh, that person is poor or that person is oppressed, and they may behave in a different way from everyone else. God's way is to say, no, we should all be treating each other fairly. Whether you are the poor and the minority or the rich and the majority, we all should follow the simple choice of doing what is right. Very wise words that really would speak to us today. Well, you know, I think Nebuchadnezzar must have liked Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because he was pretty hot-tempered. But he actually gave these three young men a second chance. He said, okay, you know, all right, maybe you made a mistake. How about this? I'll give you a second chance, but remember this. If you do not worship it, you will be thrown into the blazing furnace. So he was giving them a second chance. That's maybe the toughest of all, you know, when you're a Christian or anyone trying to stand up for what's right. Doing it the first time can be hard enough, but the second chance gives you, maybe I'll think about that. But these men would still stand tall. But you know, Nebuchadnezzar suggested, you know, he said, you will go into that fiery furnace, and you show me the God who can save you from my hand, Daniel 3:15. Well, I like that because God literally did show who it was who could save them from his hand, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saved in that fiery furnace. And the fourth man was like the Son of God that Nebuchadnezzar saw. But you know, those three young men didn't know that at the time. Before they went into that fiery furnace, they said, God, the God we serve, is able to save us from the furnace. But even if he does not save us, we will not serve your God or worship the idol that you have set up. And that's from Daniel 3:17-18. Well, we know that really angered Nebuchadnezzar. He threw them in the furnace. And yet, the fire did not destroy them, and they were saved by the fourth man in the fire, who was God himself. How can we be that brave? Well, Paul says this, 2 Timothy 1:7. And 2 Timothy, I always think of this book because this is Paul's last book, his last epistle, his last letter to the churches. He understood, as he was writing to Timothy, he understood that his life was coming to an end. He was being offered up as an offering. He knew he wasn't going to outlive this particular experience with Caesar. And yet he began this letter by saying, God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but instead a spirit of power, love, and self-discipline. As Christians, we may have to stand tall, but we have a spirit not of fear and timidity, but of power. And I like what it follows it with, and love. You know, in this world, many people might have a spirit of power and they'll show it by showing strength and aggression to others around them. But Paul says, no, we also have this power of love and self-discipline that comes through God's Spirit. It's only through God's Spirit that we may stand against the majority when the time is necessary. Because I look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and I think that was a very tough choice. And all of us will face those choices at some time or other. I think of the disciples who in the early time of being Christians had followed Jesus and done what he had asked. But then suddenly Jesus is gone. He's died on the cross, and these men are all hiding in the upper room and thinking, I'm scared. And if somebody knocks on the door, they're thinking, are they looking for filling a vacancy on a cross somewhere? I don't want to do this. And yet they turned into a powerful early church. How did that happen? Well, as it says in Acts 1:8, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. Then you will be my witnesses. The only thing they were witnessing to before was the depths of their fear. But once the Spirit came upon them, they could be brave. And they could baptize 3,000 people in one day because of their bravery. And that really is a message to us. If we want to stand up for God, we need His Spirit in our lives. Well, the last area to consider for why people follow along with the majority is conformity. That's a very powerful influence on our lives. We just want to fit in with the popular views. You know, I'm pretty amazed at how the views of what is right and wrong in America have changed so much in just, 5 to 10 years. How does that happen? Somewhere along the line, somebody told everybody that the majority was changing their opinion. And so a lot of people just went along. People's idea of right and wrong is very easily influenced. You know, Stanford Graduate School of Business and Microsoft Research in 2012 combined with a study to look at these fabricated polls. And they weren't on political issues or things like that. They're just on different issues. And they polled two distinct groups with the same questions. The only difference was that one group, they indicated which particular opinion was favored by the experts. And in the other one, they just gave them a free choice. You can choose whichever of these you want. They actually found in those two different groups there was a distinction. They found that 11.3% of people would actually go for what the experts said just on the basis of that. An 11.3% difference. Because they knew the experts agreed with this, so maybe I should do the same. They did another study as well with a third group, and they didn't say that it was the experts. They simply told them that general public opinion favored this particular idea. And even just with that simple thing, they found that there was an 8.1% difference in the results of the group who didn't know anything about what view was favored and what was less favored, to the group that were told this is what the popular people choose. Those don't necessarily sound like huge percentages, but you know, elections are usually won by a lot more than 8.1%, or a lot less than 8.1%, so we can understand why opinion polls and things often shape people's opinion as much as they reflect them. This is a very well-known sort of psychological process in humans that we go through. It's called the herd mentality. And a lot of those in society that make plans for what they want to happen go along with this and plan on this, that the herd mentality means that people will move in the direction they want them to go. It's amazing how many times we talk about the very things that they want us to talk about. You know, about a year ago, I remember all the kids in school were very upset about plastic straws, and I just, you couldn't come into school with a plastic straw without receiving many dirty looks and concerns, because in the news everyone was talking about plastic straws. Apparently, sadly, a turtle was seen with a plastic straw up its nose or something, and everybody suddenly thought the plastic straws were terrible. All the other plastic things, okay, because no one saw a picture of anything with a plastic Barbie arm stuck up their nose or whatever. That's okay, but the plastic straws were terrible. I got to tell you, now a year later, all those kids who thought straws were so terrible, they're coming in with straws, and they don't think twice about it. The reason is because they haven't been told recently that they're upset about it. And I think all of us are influenced by that. We all feel that we're very interested in the things that we're interested in, but often what we're interested in is what we're told to be interested in. You know, that's actually the thought process behind yard signs. I don't know if you've gone out during election time and seen signs for this guy for president and that guy for president. And you probably don't think to yourself, well, I'm really glad that they put that sign out there because I had no idea who was running for president. If I hadn't seen that sign, I would have been remarkably ill-informed. No, we usually know who's running for president. We see their faces on TV and all over the place. So why do people put out yard signs? Because they're trying to convince each other. If you see a majority of people in your neighborhood all supporting the same person, suddenly it starts to feel as though there's some pressure there, and you feel like you want to join in and belong. And that's what often happens. That's why the majority can shift and change. There's a certain discomfort we feel in our heart when we are in the minority. And many people try and play on that, get people to go along with their particular point of view. And that is what we see in many opinion polls. They kind of become self-proving. We look at the opinion poll, that person is up, and then other people say, well, I guess they must be up, and I want to be on the winning side. I want to support the person that the rest of my fellows in our country support. So we follow along. You know, I look at a book like Joshua and I find it kind of difficult sometimes when it describes how the Israelites were pushing people out of these different countries. But I understand maybe that God saw the power of this herd mentality, and he knew the weakness of the Israelites, that if they were surrounded by all the things that were going on in these other nations, that they wouldn't resist it for very long. And so God gave this instruction. He said, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all the carved images and their cast idols and demolish their high places. Numbers 33:52. And that really does make sense, because if those things were left around, they were very likely to be influenced by them. Elsewhere it says this, be careful not to be ensnared by inquiring about their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? Maybe we'll do the same. You must not worship the Lord your God in the way that the other nations worship their gods. Now that's kind of interesting, because it's not as though the Israelites were jumping off and worshiping another god. They were just going to worship the real God in their own way that fits in with the majority, so they could fit in better and be more like other people. But God said, no, don't be the same as other people. For they perform for their gods every detestable act that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and their daughters as sacrifices to their gods. Deuteronomy 12:29-30. You know, having studied a number of primitive and early cultures, you actually find that the idea of sacrificing your children to the angry gods was fairly commonplace. And the God of Israel was really quite different in seeking not those kinds of sacrifices, but a loving heart and changes in the way that they treated one another. So rather than treating children as a commodity to be sacrificed, God wanted people to value their children. You know, it's a sad situation when you look at God. I think of this meme when I think of the relationship between Israel and God. We have Israel, who is always distracted. Oh, there go false gods. Wow. Check that out. And there's the true God, always left wondering why Israel was looking the other way. In fact, God speaks clearly in that way. It says, they turned their backs to me and not their faces. Though I taught them again and again, they would not listen or respond to discipline. Jeremiah 32:33. Israel was always so easily distracted, following the majority, following what popular people were doing, and not following the true God who loved them so much. And so when God said, do not offer your children for sacrifices, we understand that that was against what many other cultures were doing at that time. The popular, the wise view was, children are there to be sacrificed when they need to be, but not in God's view. In fact, this is the God who said, let the little children come to me. Do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Matthew 19:14. You know, the disciples, when the children came to Jesus, they thought that the children weren't important and weren't necessary, and they're just little short stuff, and they didn't really count for much. And Jesus was angry and said, let them come. To God, children are valuable. Again, we have where Jesus says, whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. So again, children are like God himself in Jesus' eyes. But then he warns in the opposite way and says, if anyone causes one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it would have been better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Matthew 18:5 and 6. God takes his children seriously, and they are precious. And again, Matthew 25:40, we understand that Jesus says, whoever did this for the least of my brothers and sisters, they did it for me. And you can't get any more least than the children themselves. And so we understand God's abhorrence of this idea of sacrificing your children to these other gods. God said this, thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of the Lord thy God. I am the Lord. Leviticus 18:21. You know, at this time, it was a barbaric ritual. Maybe close your ears if you're squeamish. I'll explain in brief detail. They would heat this statue to boiling point, a metal statue. And the parent would take their child and place them on this scalding metal statue. And the parent would turn their back to the child. Because if you can't see the child, then surely the suffering isn't real. And then the priests would blow their trumpets loudly. Because if you couldn't hear the child, surely the suffering wasn't real. But God heard, and God saw, and he was not pleased. You know, the Israelites felt that they had good reason for wanting to do this. According to all the customs of the time, it was for prosperity and happiness. This child won't bring me prosperity and happiness, but I can have it without them because I will appease the angry gods. This is for our good. Our society will be better for this. But you know, God makes it clear that in their wisdom, they thought they were making things better for their own society. They were making it worse. In fact, God says, I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from among his people, because he hath given his seed unto Molech to defile my sanctuary and to profane my holy name. Leviticus 20, verse 3. And so we understand that sometimes what we think we're doing for our own good, in fact, is quite the opposite. And God makes it clear we are not to follow the crowd just because everyone else says that it's good, that it's okay, it's lawful, it's correct, it's the best thing to do. God says, life is precious to me. You know, it's amazing when you think that God said that what the Israelites did was almost beyond his imagination. God can imagine a lot. And I know that God knows the future, but in his heart, I am sure that God hoped that such a thing could never happen. And yet he says they have built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and their daughters to Molech. Though I never commanded it, nor did it even enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing, and so make Judah sin. Jeremiah 32:35. You know, that was the majority view of their time. It was a good thing to do. It was a wise thing to do. But just because the majority believes something doesn't make it so. In fact, as Christians, we're called to be different to that. We are told that we should say this, that we should not copy the behavior and customs of this world, but that we should let God transform us into a new person by changing the way we think. You know, it's so easy to be formed and to copy the behavior and customs of the world. But God doesn't want that. He wants us to be transformed. He wants to change the way we think. You know, in our modern era, we try and change God to fit the way we think. We do the exact opposite of what God has asked us to do. Rather than being transformed ourselves, we transform God and say, He's okay with that. Why? Because I say so. My wisdom has decided that God would be like me, and He would do what I want Him to do. But that's not what we're called to do. We are called to ask God to transform us into a new person and to change the way we think, not to change Him because of the way we think. If we do this, then, as we're told in Romans 2:12, then we will learn to know God's will for us. Not our will for God, that He would do what we want Him to, but God's will for us, that we would do what He wants. And not because He's an evil tyrant who's forcing you to do everything that He wants, but because it is the way to prosperity, it is the way to happiness, it is the way to eternal life. And it is good and pleasing and perfect. That is God's way every time. And we try and make a false God by saying God would do what I tell Him to. That does not lead to the good and pleasing and perfect life He has in mind for us. As I said at the beginning, God has had a troubled relationship with the majority. The majority very rarely has chosen God. In fact, I can think of 2 occasions when God's name came up on the ballot. And the conclusion was not good. In Old Testament times, God was their king, and He was up for re-election. And how did that go? Not so well. They had a choice between God and an earthly king, and their choice was, give us a king to rule over us, that we may be like the other nations. 1 Samuel 8:5-20 is that story. And in the New Testament times, even more heartbreaking. Jesus was there in the temple of Pontius Pilate on the balcony, and Pontius Pilate has a hardened criminal, Barabbas, the complete scum of the earth. And he has gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And he says, which candidate will you choose? Who will be the one that you want? And they cried at once, saying, away with this man. Release unto us Barabbas. And that's from Luke 23:18. And that's the way it's often been with God. The majority do not choose Him. And so if I were to ask you the question, do you think Jesus could win the presidency if He were up for re-election today? I've seen some yard signs actually which say Jesus for this year, and that would be great. He would be the best president we could possibly have. But the question is, would he get the majority? I really don't think that would be the case. But you know, Jesus said this. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would be fighting. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. John 18:36. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. But we understand that the election which happens in this world isn't the important thing. It's the election that is in your heart. There's only one vote to be cast. And the question is, will you cast that vote for Jesus? He really wants you to have a relationship with him. He wants your life to fulfill that good and pleasing and wholesome ideal that he has in mind for you. And he wants you to have a place with him in heaven. Well, I pray that each one of you will make that decision and that you will elect Jesus. You may not be in the majority, but you will be on the right side.